Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Harwood Museum of Art. It's so lovely to see all of you here tonight. My name is Gwen Fernandez. I'm the Curator of Education and Public Programs here at the Harwood, and we're just delighted that you've decided to spend your evening with us. This is our second First Friday of the year. It's a new initiative for us. Each First Friday of the month from 4 to 7 p.m. we are offering free admission to the museum plus a number of different activities. So keep coming back. We'll have a lot more going on through the rest of the year. So tonight's talk is a partnership with House Pride. We're just really delighted and honored to be working in collaboration with House Pride to bring awareness and to celebrate our queer community here in Taos. There are a number of different activities happening this weekend, including a really awesome roller derby that will be continuing after this. So if you need some excitement in your evening tonight, head over to the Youth and Family Center to catch that roller derby. Katie, is there any other programming you want to shout out?
Yes, tomorrow at the park is our big Pride in the Park event. We've got drag performers, Katie being the business, four-letter word, Aztec dancers, flamenco dancers. We just have a variety to just showcase and represent the amazing talent in Taos. That goes from 12 to 5. There's vendors, food, come out and dance with us. And then in the evening is the Alley Drag Show, starting at 9 p.m.
Yeah.
From Pride, I just want to say thank you to Harwood for coming and speaking. And I have to get back to the roller disco. It seems that they've got way too many things going on, so I just want to stay.
Thank you, Katie. We didn't plan that ahead of time, obviously. But yeah, there's so many great events happening this weekend. Please extend the fun. I did also want to note that tonight's lecture is being recorded for broadcast on KCI at some point later. So share with your friends and family if they missed the talk tonight. They can catch it on the radio. We're also recording this evening and we'll be sharing it on our YouTube. So there'll be a chance to hear and revisit Christian's talk later. So tonight's talk, as you can see, is titled Out West, Gay and Lesbian Artists in New Mexico from 1900 to 1969. This is a project that Christian is currently working on as part of an exhibition, which will be, he'll speak a little bit more about when you can see the show. But I did want to just give a brief introduction to Christian. Christian Waguespack is the head of Curatorial Affairs and Curator of 20th Century American Art, playing double duty at the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe. In his over 6 years there, he's organized 20 exhibitions. He conducts research on the museum's collection, focusing on modern art and art of the American Southwest, and has lectured widely on various aspects of New Mexican art history across the country. He has an exhibition on view right now at the museum called With the Grain. If you haven't seen it yet, you have 1 more month to see that show, which includes some of the Patrocino Barella works that the Harwood has in our collection. So highly encourage you to get down and see that show. His exhibitions at the museum have included broad surveys of Southwestern art history and deep dives into the careers of historic artists and art groups from the region. So without further ado, let's welcome Christian.
I want to start by saying thank you to Gwen and to Nicole and to Juniper and to Hannah and to everybody at the Harwood Museum for having me here. It's always a treat to be invited to speak, so thank you very much. And a big thanks to Taos Pride for everything that you all do for the community. We're good? Okay, I promise that I won't make that happen. And a big thanks to Taos Pride for everything that you do in the community. And of course, thank you all for being here tonight. You could be doing 100 different things on your Friday and you chose to be here, so I really appreciate that. So without further ado, let's dive right in. For the better part of the 20th century, northern New Mexico represented the possibility of a life that cannot be lived elsewhere. It was and is a place outside of the norm, and this was particularly true for gay men and lesbian women in the first half of the 20th century. What drew so many gay artists to this rural outpost was the potential for a sort of sexual freedom and a community of acceptance that has only recently been getting the attention that it deserves. For many gay men and lesbian women, life in New Mexico offered the promise of a freedom and a community that they've since been denied. Anyone who's even passingly familiar with the history of Santa Fe and of Taos would readily acknowledge the profound impact that artist communities have had in crafting the distinct identity of northern New Mexico. Perhaps not so readily acknowledged is the importance of queer communities for making New Mexico an arts destination and the vital role that gay men and lesbian women played in the northern New Mexican art scene. In his engaging memoir, Unbuttoned, Gay Life in the Santa Fe Art Scene, Walter Cooper presents the challenge that when it comes to the legacy of our local history, quote, so much of our queer history has been swept under the rug. It's almost as if we never existed. People tend to underrate or ignore the queer factor, the enormous impact gay folks have made on New Mexico's unique cultural life, end quote. What drew so many gay artists to this part of the country was the potential for a sort of sexual freedom that they were denied elsewhere, all the while building a cultural and artistic community often more welcoming to outsiders of all kinds. And these are the ideas that fueled the exhibition that this talk is related to. It will open later this year at the New Mexico Museum of Art in Santa Fe. The scope is a little bit different than what I'm going to be presenting tonight. Tonight I'm just going to be talking about gay and lesbian and queer and gender nonconforming artists from New Mexico, but the exhibition itself will take a broader scope and look at the Southwest, including artists from Colorado and Arizona and West Texas too. But we don't have time for them tonight, we're just looking at New Mexicans. And I would be remiss if I didn't start this presentation by acknowledging some of the problems in scope. The idea of organizing this project around gay and lesbian artists is a very limiting way to look at the material because, of course, as we know, gay, lesbian, bi, trans, gender nonconforming people have always been with us everywhere in every place across the world. And particularly here in New Mexico, it's important to acknowledge that the gay, lesbian, binary, or even the incorporation of bisexuality or trans people here is superimposed on top of a long-standing tradition of indigenous cultural identity that falls outside of the way that Western cultures have understood gender identity historically. And even though this individual falls a little bit outside the time scope of the artists that I wanted to look at for this project, I would be remiss if I didn't start off this project by acknowledging Wewa's influence and legacy here in New Mexico, and talking about the impact and continued legacy of Two-Spirit people and indigenous communities. So for those of you who don't know, the individual in these photographs, their name is Wewa. They were a Zuni Imana, which would translate generally to Two-Spirit person, even though that distinction has varying degrees of specificity across different cultural groups. And since I'm not an indigenous expert, I'm not going to try and dive into that too much, but I wanted to give you a little bit of what I could. So research shows that more than 150 different pre-colonial Native American tribes acknowledge third genders in their community. Wawe was a Lamana, a Two-Spirit individual, and took on both male and female tasks in Zuni cultural, and acted as a Zuni cultural ambassador, as well as a pottery and textile artist. Also a spiritual leader, Wewa endeavored to preserve the history, traditions, and knowledge of the Zuni people. Though born a male-bodied person, community members recognize that Wewa demonstrated traits associated with Two-Spirit individuals as early as ages of 3 or 4. In Zuni culture, Two-Spirit individuals were male-born persons who took on the social and ceremonial roles generally performed by women. They usually, though not exclusively, wore women's clothing and mostly took up labors associated with women in the culture. Two-Spirit individuals constituted a socially recognized third gender role within the tribe and often held positions of honor in the community. And I should say that Wewa was known to dress in both male and female clothing. People that knew this person and wrote about them used both gender pronouns interchangeably when talking about this person. and that they would present in various forms depending on what they were doing at the general time. The images that I'm showing you here are particularly interesting when we think about Hugo's role as a cultural ambassador. So in their position as a strong cultural figure in the Zuni tribe, they not only broke with established gender roles and traditions, but also social roles and traditions, and interacted a bit more freely with outsiders than other people would. This included things like trade. Hugo was one of the very first people from Zuni Pueblo to commercially trade their textiles and pottery with white folks from other communities, establishing that artistic legacy and that kind of industrial and commercial legacy too. What's very interesting for me is these photographs and where they were taken. So these were in Washington, D.C., and Hugo traveled extensively across the United States, particularly going to Washington and meeting the president during that time as an ambassador for the Zuni people. And while they experienced a significant amount of acceptance within the Zuni community, this was also a time where this practice was being pushed against by the federal government, by cultural institutions who were moving into New Mexico and hoping to force, in many ways, assimilation on the people who lived there. So you had this kind of, on the one hand, acceptance and celebration of this person, but this person maybe more as an individual, while this aspect of the community and culture was being essentially weeded out to make way for more conservative and cultural moral values.
Were those images from the late 1800s?
Yes.
Late 1900s.
These are from, oh, I'm sorry, that's a typo. They're the late 1800s. Good eye. These were taken in the late 1800s by John Hiller, and these are in the collection of the New Mexico History Museum's photo archives. Thanks. Marston Hartley is the next person I want to talk about. And folks who've spent a little bit of time here and hopefully gone through the galleries will recognize, at least in style, at least one of these paintings, the New Mexico Recollections. There's a different one that is on display right now in this fantastic exhibition that's on loan from the Vilcek collection. And I'm pairing it here with Marston Hartley's El Santo, which is a painting in the collection of the New Mexico Museum of Art. And Marston Hartley is an incredibly interesting figure in the history of 20th century American art. He came out to New Mexico with a group of modernists that I'm sure we're all very familiar with now. We don't need to go into that. Stayed with Maple Dodge, all that good stuff. Hartley did not quite take to New Mexico as well as some of these other folks. And this is not surprising because Hartley did not take well to anywhere that he ever went in his life. He was known for being perennially grim. And traveled around, felt incredibly restless, and moved from place to place to place. But he did come to New Mexico and for a brief stay in 1918 and 1919. And while he was here, he had a few things that he was working on. One was he was looking to the American West, as so many other modernists were during this time, for a uniquely American modernist vision for art. So looking not only to the local cultures, as you can see in El Santo, and we can unpack that in a bit if you like, but also to the landscape. Now the painting that I'm showing you here, the Recollections, these were not painted in New Mexico. He did do some landscape work in New Mexico, but these would have been smaller pastels that were done from the land itself. And they are distinctively brighter and lighter than these. They're not that bright by New Mexico standards, but you can only expect so much from somebody like Hartley. So this sojourn here in New Mexico came on the heels of a pretty dramatic and traumatic experience in Hartley's life. Hartley was living and working in Berlin, which he liked very much, which is a surprise that he liked anything. But he got on very well there for a bit. This is pre-World War II, and during that, pre-World War I and pre-World War II. And during his time there, he fell in love with a German military officer named Claude Freiburg. And the painting that I'm showing you here, Portrait of a German Officer, is a tribute to that individual who died very shortly after their meeting. He was shot off of his horse in the line of duty. And the reason that I'm showing you this is to kind of explain how Hartley would be looking back on New Mexico when he returns to Berlin later to make the New Mexico Recollection series. But one of the interesting things about his German paintings are the way that you can decode some of his coded language, right? So as a gay man, he wanted to make a painting about a lost love, but wasn't able to do it as freely as other people might have been able to. And the way that he is able to accomplish this is by representing that person through coded symbols. Some more coded than others. So one, for instance, in the bottom left-hand corner are the initials KVF, which stand for Karl von Freiburg. Not incredibly subtle, but still there. Other insignia include, the Iron Cross, which would relate to his military regalia. The number 24, which would have related to the day that he was shot dead from his horse, October 24th, and other coded references to this individual person, including numbers that relate to the Kaiser troop that he was part of. So this happens. Hartley moves back to the United States and begins making work like this here in New Mexico. And here we often read this as through the lens of his attempt to work in the same vein as the other American modernists, to look to distinctly American subject matter to create an American modernism, which it certainly is doing and is great. But if we understand it through the lens of the work that he made in Berlin about Karl von Freiburg, we begin to think a little bit more subtly about the particular kind of things that he wants to include in his paintings and the way that they might be coded in certain ways that could be read through a queer perspective that wouldn't necessarily be read by other people. At first glance, I think this seems pretty innocuous, right? We have the indigenous blanket, we have the black pot, we have some greenery coming out of the black pot, which might suggest that Hartley didn't really know how these pots were supposed to be used. And the Spanish retablo. If we take a close look at the Spanish retablo and the greenery that's coming out of the pot, these two things both have specific connotations relating them to the Penitente Brotherhood. And the Penitente Brotherhood, though in no way queer on its own, is interesting to me because it's something that many gay artists latch onto again and again and again. And they're coming to New Mexico and they're trying to kind of understand and work through our culture. And I'll show you that in a couple of other instances. But here, this is because the figure of Christ that you see in that retablo is Jesus Nazareno, which is the patron figure for the Penitente Brotherhood itself. So it's a distinctive way of representing the figure of Christ that's particularly heavily associated with that group. The yucca plant that's coming out of the pot is the same fibers that the Penitente Brotherhood would use to make the whips that they use for self-flogging rituals in their Holy Week ritual. And we'll unpack a little bit more about ways in which the Penitente Brotherhood were interesting to folks like Hartley and later Katie Wells, who I'll talk about in a minute. But I want to just get back to the landscape really quick. So what is he doing back in Berlin thinking about New Mexico, creating images like this? And I will say that he did a pretty good series of New Mexico recollections when he was in Berlin. This is number 12. I don't remember exactly how many, but I would say maybe about 20 or so. There's one outside, it's really lovely, and I would suggest everybody go take a look at it because they're real beauties to see. But while he was there, he was of course put back in the mindset of Karl von Freiburg and this potential for a life that he could have lived if it wasn't taken away from him by death and by war and by shifting cultural and social norms. And I should point out that when Hartley was in Berlin, records show that even though homosexuality was still illegal on the books, there were over 50 thriving operational gay bars in that city during that time. That changed pretty quickly over the course of the 20th century for reasons that we all know, but it's an important cultural lesson remembering that things don't always move forward in ways that we would like them to. So Hartley's back in Berlin. Why thinking of New Mexico? Why thinking of this place? And how is he using it? So ways that scholars have kind of deconstructed these paintings are looking at the figures of the fallen logs and looking at some of the other pieces that he incorporates into these compositions. And in most of them, what you see is a reoccurring kind of formula where you've got the rolling mountains. They're oftentimes deeply red, which I find interesting because this is not a color that I readily associate with New Mexico landscapes. It reads a little bit more Arizona to me. We have to remember that for Hartley, these aren't about capturing a realistic idea of what the land actually looked like. They are ways to work through emotions and trauma and feelings and projecting those onto the landscape. So geological and scientific accuracy are important. Another place that we see that, not particularly in this one, but in others, are his use of trees that aren't trees that you would find in New Mexico at all. usually you'll find two trees in these paintings, and they'll be in the foreground, and they're almost always felled and separated. And these are oftentimes read as self-representations for Hartley and for Karl von Freiburg. One of the trees is usually completely felled and dead. That's a representation of Freiburg. The other one is oftentimes felled, but maybe the roots are still intact, or there might be a leaf or something growing from it. It's maimed, it's hurt, but it's not completely gone. And these are read as self-representations of Hartley himself. And they are almost always separated by either a gash of color, a body of water, a chasm. So there is that inability to get back to that which you once loved. And I think it's very interesting that during this time, Hartley is back in a place where he felt arguably more comfortable than most of the other places that he visited, somewhere that he deliberately went back to, but was thinking about here, and that he was able to use New Mexico as a place to work through his own trauma. And I think that what he was doing with that is so similar to the way that other artists who might have stayed and used the actual place, the actual experience of being here and living here and building community here. He didn't do that, but he took it with him. And he was able to use the desert Southwest as this way to work through his own trauma and work towards his own being in the same way that many of the artists who actually lived here did. Now, Katie Wells is another artist who was perennially grim and made some of the darkest representations of New Mexico that we've got. And I'm showing you some of his later work. So if you think about his early work, it went through, generally speaking, 3 phases. So you could break it down more nuanced than that. But his early work were these very light, bright, rhythmic watercolors on watercolor paper. And his primary medium was watercolor. He worked almost entirely in watercolor. At one point in his career, Georgia O'Keeffe did bully him into trying oils, and we have about 5 of those left. And he didn't like it. You can see some up at the New Mexico Museum right now if you want to take a look, but he really needed to stick with watercolors. Oils were his forte. He had a lot of talents, but oil painting wasn't one of them. The watercolors, on the other hand, I think are lovely. So the first series are almost all New Mexican landscapes, done in this very light, airy style, that if you saw the early painting by Agnes Martin in the hallway, they resemble that, but a little bit more loosely. Also, Dosberg's early paintings, and some of Jensen's early paintings too. His later work, it gets darker and heavier as it goes on, and in many ways removes itself from the landscape. So I'm showing you here Katie Wells' Confused Memory from 1950 and his Head of Santo from 1939. So Confused Memory was made towards the very end of his life, and he didn't live a very long life. He only lived into his 50s himself. He served in World War II, which he found particularly traumatic. He lived in just outside of Los Alamos, and during the time of experimentation with the bomb and the creation of the labs, he was a very vocal advocate against having that there, because of his fear of the danger of the bomb itself, also because of his disgust at the contamination of indigenous lands that this building the lab was causing. So he did not like that at all, and he wasn't shy about it at all. And it was something that he incorporated into his daily life to the point where we have invitations to dinner that he wrote to people saying, you know, I would like you to come to my house for dinner on Thursday at such and such a time, if we are still here. And so this later work, like Confused Memory, is representational of the kind of more surreal and cerebral direction that he went later in his life. The Head of Santo, the other thing that he did, other than being a painter that was particularly important for us in New Mexico, was he was one of the first major collectors of Spanish colonial art. He was very enthusiastic about that art form. He traveled around the state purchasing pieces for his own collection, but with the intent of preservation. And he promised the people that he bought them from that they would remain here in New Mexico. And there was a point where he almost broke that promise later in his life. He was getting just absolutely fed up with what was going on in Los Alamos. He didn't think that a state that would support that sort of thing deserved this kind of material. He tried to sell his house and move to the Caribbean, and quite frankly, who wouldn't? But he didn't do that. He did stay here, and he did end up donating his collection of Spanish colonial art to the Museum of New Mexico, and it's in the History Museum right now, with the caveat that his friend E. Boyd become the first curator, which I think is a pretty good deal for both of them. But he took to this artwork very strongly, and it was a time before it was being seriously considered as fine art by the broader community. But one of the things that he does with it that I find particularly interesting is the way that he's able to use these and not create still life so much as create portraits. And they're very deep and very heavy, and many of them are very difficult to look at. And this is watercolor, but the way that he's zoomed into the face, the way that he's really pulled out those greens to make the flesh look rotted and mortified. The way that he's been able to make the watercolor that he's working with as sticky as possible. So those red streaks, when you see this in person, really do look like drying blood, speak to a darkness and a turmoil that he's projecting onto this work and also responding to in this work. And here's a nice picture of him smiling happily in his studio by Lord Gilman, and somebody that we'll talk about a little bit later. But you can get a sense of the way that he works. And one of the things that I find particularly interesting about his watercolor application is that he works additively and subtractively. So on both of this kind of work, you'll see that he puts down the watercolor, but he also scratches into the surface to create layers. And so you'll find in his artist toolkit sponges, paintbrushes, but also knives. So he's literally cutting into these things and really making them bleed. What I found the most interesting in looking through his toolbox was that one of his favorite painting tools was the brush that he used for his dachshunds, the wire brush. You can get good texture with that. Like Hartley, but much more enthusiastically, Katie Wells was fascinated by the Penitent Brotherhood. And this is one of the paintings that he made that was about that group. The Harwood has, I think, one of the best watercolors of the Mirada that he's done. And I borrowed it a few times, and I'm afraid they're going to stop loaning it to me if I keep asking. This one is in a collection in California, but here he's showing the inside of a Mirada. And for folks who don't know, Miradas are penitente houses of worship. They're usually windowless. They are secret. They are places that people will go in and pray and also perform some sort of self-flagellation rites, but usually that's more associated with the Easter Holy Week procession. And this group got a really bad rap in the early part of the 20th century when other folks were coming into New Mexico and trying to digest the northern New Mexican Hispanic culture that was already here. And many of them came with prejudices that were racial, that were cultural, that Catholicism really wasn't something that people were interested in incorporating into American culture at this time. There were stories made and publicized about the Penitent Brotherhood that accused them of murder and these horrible rites of torture. There was even a horror movie made in the 1920s called The Lash of the Penitentes. This is to say that the group became unfairly sensationalized, and people were focusing on what they considered to be the most audacious aspects of their practice. And Katie Wells is certainly doing this too. But it's important to keep in mind from Wells's point of view as somebody who is deeply saddled with guilt, and he writes about this himself. The idea of a religious organization where guilt is central, and Catholicism is very much that, where self-punishment is part of the practice and a path to kind of forgiveness and something else, and the idea that you have an all-male group that meet in secrecy in these clandestine rooms appealed to Katie Wells for a number of different reasons. They did a few other gay men, reasons that I don't think maybe are fair, but I can imagine one's imagination going wild. And just a little bit of background about Wells himself. He grew up in a wealthy family in Southbridge, Massachusetts, and was openly effeminate from a young age. And his father wanted to kind of make him a little bit more manlier. And so finally, after Katie Wells was kicked out of boarding school after boarding school after boarding school, he said enough, and he sent him in what I consider to be probably one of the most poorly calculated moves in family history to a dude ranch in Arizona, which the young Katie Wells liked very much. The other thing that he liked very much was the West itself and the land and the kind of life that you live in here. So that's what inspired him to kind of stay out here. And between those times, he traveled through East Asia to learn Japanese brushwork. Well, he went to learn Japanese brushwork. Wells had a problem with commitment. And so he got out there, he set up classes, took a few of them and realized this is far too hard. And I don't actually want to do this. So he took bonsai classes for the rest of the trip and came back. And one of the things that I think has really kind of done him a favor in allowing him to create images that's very unique in terms of New Mexico's visual history is that he never took to a teacher. He never studied under somebody earnestly. He would flitter to different people, but then ended up kind of doing his own thing, which I think is very him and resulted in some very interesting work. And I will say that at one point, George O'Keeffe did say that he was the second best painter in New Mexico. I'll let you guess who number one was. And as anyone who knows me knows, you cannot put me in an art museum and give me a microphone and expect me not to talk about Rebecca Salisbury Strand James. Even though she was not a lesbian, I want to talk a little bit about the community that Katie Wells was able to build when he was out here, and some of the things that came out of that. So this is one of my favorite pieces by Wells in our museum's collection. It's titled Rebecca S. James, and it's a petit point stitch that he made in St. Croix for her. And it's indicative of that kind of later biomorphic, kind of toxic colored painting he would do. But what I think is interesting is the way that he's kind of breaking with gender norms to make a piece like this, that he's working with petit point, which is a medium that's been so heavily gendered female for so long. And that he picked that up, did something interesting with it, and then dedicated it to Rebecca Salisbury Strand James, and she reciprocated. This is a reverse painting on glass that she made called Katie Making a Nice Speech. And I would really love to hear her explain what's going on. Because this is a cobra with a little flower in its mouth singing a song. And no matter how many years I've studied art history, I don't know where to go with that. So if anybody wants to unpack this painting, I would be happy to talk with you. But one of the things that I find interesting about both these folks is that neither of them were able to really take off and make a career for themselves the way that other people in their communities were, for a variety of reasons. But I think one of them was that they didn't self-promote very much, and they would often give work away to each other and to other people. And so you have a lot of Becky James's pieces that are signed to particular people and just given to them. And the same with Wells. Most of his work came into our museum's collection through his estate and through his brother Mason. And Mason talked a bit about how, so Wells is a difficult person to work with as an art historian because he didn't title things, he didn't date things, he would paint something and then he was done with it. And Wells talks about, Mason Wells talks about kind of having to follow up with him and be like, Katie, can you please put a date on this or sign this or give us something? And oftentimes Katie would just make things up. So the dates that are on things aren't always necessarily accurate, but his style is so distinctive over periods that you can get a good sense of when he was working. The last artist that I want to talk about who I think had an unnatural interest in the Penitente Brotherhood was Russell Cheney, and he's a bit less known for New Mexico art aficionados, and that's because he really wasn't very much of a New Mexico artist. He was really an East Coast guy. Born in Connecticut, died in Maine, studied and lived and worked most of his life there, and he's really known within the circles of East Coast New England Impressionism. But he did come west. He came west because he got sick. And he came out to Colorado Springs to have higher and drier air and to heal. And during that trip, he did come to New Mexico a few times, particularly Taos, to paint. And it strikes me as particularly interesting that this person would make the Penitente Brotherhood for them their stand-in for what is New Mexico. And this painting is titled New Mexico Penitente. And here we see a bulto, a religious figure of St. Francis that you would find inside a Mirada, a little vase of flowers, and of course I'm sure many of us know that there's a long tradition of the little paper flowers inside of Miradas and inside chapels here in northern New Mexico. The cross, and these crosses that I imagine we're all very familiar with, are oftentimes penitente crosses in the landscape. George O'Keeffe's first paintings of New Mexico were these crosses, and she talked about them as these icons of the country. And they, kind of and I like the way that he's even incorporated the shadow there, the way that they're cast down from the hills that they're usually incorporated in. And then again, the axe, and I believe that the axe is a reference to Doña Sebastiana in the death carts, the skeletal figure that's often pulled around in Catholic Holy Week processions that has an axe or bow and arrow, and is this reminder of death, but is also deeply associated with the Brotherhood too. Agnes Sims, very interesting woman, born in Pennsylvania, came out to New Mexico, and was one of those folks who just always seemed to be on fire. She came out here, she opened up a record store until the war made materials for getting vinyl difficult to come by. So then she opened up a construction company with her and her partner, and they built houses in Santa Fe and along Canyon Road, and then she noticed that the folks that she had hired to build the houses liked to sing on their lunch breaks. So she organized them into a band, and she toured that band around New Mexico. And in her free time, she enjoyed pushing the paints a bit. And here you see her looking very poetic in front of one of her paintings. And then here I'm showing you a selection of the kind of carvings that she would do. And here's again another one of those carvings, the deer dance. This is a painting that she did called Ceremonial Animals. And I bring these in to show her very obvious interest in trends in European modernism, including Cubism, and the kind of blending of indigenous cultures that she found here in this place that she landed with modernist abstract language, right? So this deer dance, of course, is coming out of the deer dance, which we all know, which is turned into this interesting cubist figure with the face turned to the side, done just in profile while the body faces forward, and the forms, refined, just very simple shapes. And then Ceremonial Animal, I've always found an incredibly touching painting, just in terms of not only the way that she's incorporating Cubism and that lovely kind of light approach to applying the paint and the iridescent kind of shimmering across the surface, but the desperation of something like this and the idea of being pinned down and helpless and how that must have felt for somebody who was kind of running from Pennsylvania and trying to establish a life for oneself. It's difficult for me to read a painting like this outside of that context. And these are examples of some of her earlier work that'll be in the exhibition in Santa Fe. The other thing that she really took to when she came to New Mexico was the petroglyphs. As many folks may know, the New Mexico Museum of Art was founded by Billy Hewitt, who was an anthropologist, and he had a heavy interest in incorporating anthropology into, or artists who worked with an anthropological perspective into the collecting practices of that museum. So we see that over and over and over again. Sims was living in Galisteo, and Galisteo has fantastic petroglyphs that were within walking distance, and she would oftentimes walk through them, study them. She was interested in them not only because of the way that they are ancient, but also strikingly modern in terms of their form and shape. But she was also deeply kind of interested in the spiritual practices that were going on in New Mexico, and she oftentimes talked about incorporating magic into her work. And so she wanted to capture that in a certain way. And what I'm showing you here is a bit of a mural that she made for a bank in Santa Fe. We have several of these in the museum's collection. But taking the visual language of the petroglyphs that she studied and incorporating them into her own work. And then doing this research project of the San Cristobal petroglyphs, where she recorded the pieces that she would find there and turned it into a portfolio. So she was an incredibly important person in terms of literally building parts of Santa Fe as an architect, in terms of working with anthropologists to capture this part of New Mexico's ancient history, and then her own creative endeavors. And if you want to learn more about her, I'm going to do a shameless plug for a talk that I'm doing at the Southwest Art History Conference in October that will just be about her. So I will leave it at that, and hope that you will come hear me talk about her more. Robert Gribrock, interesting figure, part of the Transcendental Painting Group, who, as many of you, I believe, would know, was founded here in Taos, New Mexico. They were a group of artists who were dedicated to incorporating the spiritual, non-corporeal into an art practice and making a space for non-objective art that was not tied to the real world, but was tied to psychology, magic, and mysticism, and science. And on top of the fact that this is an incredibly revolutionary way for an artist group in New Mexico during the early part of the 20th century to think, and I would remind people that the Taos Society of Artists were working not very far in time or place away from folks like the Taos Society of Artists. Did I say that twice?
Yeah.
Okay. the Tau Society were there around the same time the Transitional Painting Group were getting started. So you had these two completely oppositional approaches to what art could and should be happening just down the street from one another is an amazing feat in and of itself. Robert Gerbach was one of these folks. Like Hartley, he did not like Taos. He thought it was way too social. There was too much artsy, I know, right? Isn't that funny? Way too much artsy stuff going on, and he wanted none of it. So he tried Santa Fe and thought, this is way too social. There's way too much artsy stuff going on, and I want none of it. So he moves to Isleta Pueblo and lives on the Pueblo with his mother, who is often described as domineering. He didn't get out much. I'm seeing shades of Norman Bates, but I don't want to project. And as an artist and member of the Transitional Painting Group, and another thing that I really like about the Transitional Painting Group is that many of them worked across a broad swath of styles. So they did make works of pure abstraction, but then they worked in figuration, and then they worked in cubism. They tried out a lot of things, and I appreciate that. And this is the kind of work that came out of his TBG era. And if it's reminiscent of O'Keeffe's Flowers in the Landscape, okay, fine. Maybe she did it first, but I like what he did with it too. And he does several of these kind of floating flower-like figures above these very highly technicolored desert landscapes. He would also do these lovely kind of somber realistic paintings. And this is his portrait, his landscape of his life, Pueblo. And if that landscape that's in the bottom of the floating flower picture strikes you as familiar, what he did after he left New Mexico was illustrate the Wile E. Coyote cartoons and incorporate that kind of coloration and that kind of style in the Southwest desert into the Bugs Bunny and Wile E. Coyote cartoons. So hopefully now, look at that now and tell me you don't see an animal flower. And so, remarkably kind of cemented what the Southwest was in the popular imagination of generations of Americans who know Albuquerque because Bugs Bunny took a wrong turn there. That's the first place I ever heard of Albuquerque. And from this cartoon work, and I just think that that's something that, to have that impact as an artist here and then to go on to have this popular impact, I would like to understand how he justified thinking Taos was too peopled and social for him to live in, but then he moved to LA. But to have that impact and to really, make that contribution to what most Americans and most of the world thought of New Mexico and thought of the West for so long is very powerful. And if that wasn't enough, he must have also been one hell of a cook because he won $10,000 as the cookout champion. And there's him looking very happy in his studio. Now, another figure that I want to talk about is Laura Gilpin. Laura Gilpin is another fascinating individual, a photographer, grew up in Colorado, around Colorado Springs, had a turkey farm, and turned that turkey farm into a career as a photographer. So she sold her turkey farm to go study photography in New York with Gertrude Casavere and continued her career as a photographer. She's best known for her work photographing indigenous landscapes and indigenous people in the early part of the 20th century, making really lovely prints. So I'm showing you here her Taos drums from 1946, and this is an example of a very early still life to give you some ideas of the school of photography that she came out of, that kind of pictorialist, aesthetic, very quiet, poetic moments. But she's, considered to be, I believe, the grandmother of photography here in the Southwest. Worked at the Colorado Springs Fine Art Institute. I believe she had the first exhibition of photography at the New Mexico Museum of Art. Her work was certainly some of the first photographs acquired there, and gave us some very fascinating looks at particularly the Navajo Nation, but other indigenous communities here in northern New Mexico. That's Laura Gilpin. Another wonderful photographer who I want to talk about is Anne Noggle. And I'm showing you here some of her later works. These aren't included in the project, but I want to talk about them a little bit so you can see where she went after her earlier bit. Anne Noggle was a pilot. She was a pilot in World War II. And there you see her doing a self-portrait as a pilot. Her later work was best known for these kind of Cindy Sherman-esque self-representational playing with identity. And one of the reasons why I stopped this project in 1969 is because that's the year Stonewall happened. And that's the year that I think that the discourse around many gay, lesbian, queer, trans artists really shifted. And if you've noticed that a lot of the work that we talked about so far doesn't really seem to have a lot to do with somebody being gay, that, or queer, or lesbian, or transgender, that's something that was interesting to me about the way this project kind of turned out. That when we're looking at this time frame, turn of the century to 1969, I will be interested in the way that folks come into the gallery and if they think that they're just seeing a survey of New Mexico art, because it could very much just be that. But after this time, after Stonewall, moving, and this is broad general strokes, there are artists who are working with issues of self-representation before this time. It became wildly popular and important after Stonewall and later. And Gilman's work shifts, or Noggle's work shifts to these works that are about self-representation, about who she is. She did a lot of work around aging. She has this facelift series, and she talks about her interest in, what it is, being in her female body and watching herself change over time and looking in the mirror and seeing the same face that she knows, but it's so dramatically different than the one that she believes is herself. And what it means to be able to kind of take control over her own body by changing it surgically. This is happening in 1970. Other artists continue to work with this idea of intervening in their own body as artwork in contemporary art now. And then here, Noggle's piece, it is I, it is he, it is she. Doing drag, playing again with gender identity. This is an homage to VDC. That person would be Van Daren Koch, who is a significant photography historian who was working in Albuquerque when Noggle was a professor there too. But again, I think that this interest in how they're being seen, what is their role as a woman photographer and a lesbian photographer in this world that's dominated by people like Van Daren Koch? Do they actually need to adopt that persona to be taken seriously? So this is a portion of her career that is fascinating. And I will do another plug for Kate Ware speaking at, she's the curator of photography at the New Mexico Museum of Art. She's going to be talking about Noggle's work at the Southwest Art History Conference. So come hear her tell you more about that. But this is the kind of work that she made before that time. Gravediggers, Twin Bed are the two pieces that will be in the exhibition in Santa Fe. And here you can see a more poetic approach to photography. And I say poetic because I think that this kind of work relies heavily on mood and on context and on innuendo. They're not necessarily put together to be aesthetically pleasing in the way that the work of the early, not that they're not, but the way the work of the early pictorialists were. They're not strictly documentary, they're not portraits, but they're suggestions of a time and a place and a feeling that I think are an interesting way to work through photography, which is a medium that during this time especially was so deeply rooted in the literal, that to try and unhinge that and to make photography that was more about poetics is a deep and important thing. And here I'm just showing Anne Noggle's portrait of Laura Gilman in terms of the way that some of these artists are honoring one another down the line, and I think this is just a very sweet image. Now another artist to discuss is R.C. Gorman, and everybody in Taos I'm sure is familiar with R.C. Gorman or has heard of him, so we don't need too much of an introduction. The Navajo artist, this is an early piece out of the Yei. Gorman was hailed as the Picasso of the Southwest and a champion of indigenous arts and somebody who really brought Navajo painting into the popular world. And perhaps, I think most importantly, opened the first indigenous-run art gallery in the United States, which was here in Taos. And I think that nobody has really passed through Santa Fe or Taos without seeing some of this work and him becoming so popularized, so kind of incorporated into the grain of the way that our part of the country is incorporated into the popular imagination, that it's difficult to think of how people would conceptualize aspects of this place without his artistic contributions. Architecturally speaking, somebody who I find very interesting is Betty Stewart. And this one I'm cheating a little bit because the art object that she's responsible for happened in 1970. But given that it's architecture, she had to have been thinking about it in 1969. For those of you who don't know Betty Stewart, this is a portrait of her and her good friend Sally. In Betty Stewart, another kind of trailblazing person who just had to be on fire all the time, grew up in rural Texas and came out to New Mexico as a way to get away from the conservative town that she was in. She was working through battling her own alcoholism and coming out as a lesbian in rural Texas in the early part of the 20th century on her own, and you had to really have some backbone, I think, to be able to do that. She comes out to Santa Fe, is an architect, and decides that she wants a pitched roof house. And if anybody has ever tried to do anything architecturally speaking in Santa Fe, you know that if you don't sell your soul to the devil himself, you're not getting any of it done. The Santa Fe ordinances dictating the way that architecture is supposed to look are rigid and extreme and difficult to work around. Now, of course, that Santa Fe style is itself an invention of the 20th century. It is what Santa Fe is supposed to look like. It's not what Santa Fe did actually look like, which is fine. I think it's lovely. I enjoy seeing it. But Betty Stewart was responsible for spearheading the very first pitched roof houses, getting that ordinance loosened up so you could build in that particular kind of way. And this was at the crux of her working as an architect, an architectural historian to prove her case, and somebody who just did not back down from a fight. She pushed it through, and now when you drive through Santa Fe and see a pitched roof house, you can thank Betty Stewart for that. Oh, and here's just an interesting read on her, if you'd like to know a little bit more about her, the life of Betty Stewart in City Different. This is the author, Mark Cross, and his little friend. Now, so far we've talked about folks who pretty neatly identify as gay or lesbian during this time, but of course that was not always the case, and gender identity is a lot more complicated than that. So I wanted to wrap up by talking about a few folks who don't so neatly fall within these categories and these corrals of self-representation that we're comfortable with folks fitting themselves into. And I want to talk a little bit about Marston Hartley, who's pictured here. He was a Navajo two-spirit individual, born male, but assigned male at birth, but lived their life in a way that embraced aspects of both genders. And most importantly, that manifested in being a medicine person and a very successful medicine person, someone who was known to have memorized some of these complicated things by the age of 10. They worked with sand paintings primarily, but was also an accomplished weaver, and that's what I'm showing you here. And their claim to fame in this part of the world, and the world of Navajo weaving, was that Cloth thought to merge these two aspects of their life and made Navajo weavings that depicted Navajo sand paintings. And both of these activities were heavily gendered in the Navajo community. Being a medicine man was a very male thing to do, being a weaver was a very female thing to do. And to make these images that would be used in a healing ceremony public really was not something that a lot of folks who were in those fraternal medicine societies were interested in doing. And to that point, much of this work is still not something that goes on public view. So there won't be any of the textiles that Claude made on view in the exhibition, because the Wheelwright Museum doesn't put them out for very understandable reasons. Part of this came from the privileged nature of these ceremonies, particularly at a time where so much of Indigenous and Navajo religion was being taken away from people. In many ways, the only way to keep it safe was to keep it secret. The other kind of more nuts and bolts part of this is that sand paintings were meant to be temporary. That's part of how they work. So to kind of make them concrete in textile was going very heavily against cultural norms at the time. So though none of this work will be on view in the exhibition, Cloth had a deep and profound impact on many Indigenous artists of the 20th century moving forward. Alan Hauser and R.C. Gorman both immortalizing him in their own respective media. So they will be represented in that way. The other important cultural contribution that Cloth made was the founding of the Wheelwright Museum itself. So they became very close friends with Mary Cabot Wheelwright. and opened that as a space that was about Navajo religion. And the original name for that museum was the Museum of Navajo Religion. It went through other various names around that before it landed on the Indigenous Art Museum that it is now. But Claude founded that with Mary Cabot Wheelwright as a place to preserve these cultural traditions that they felt they were in danger of losing at the time. And that's part of the reason why, if you've been to the Wheelwright, it's shaped like a hogan, which I think is very interesting. And I would be out of my mind to come to Taos, New Mexico, and not talk a little bit about Agnes Martin. And I'm putting Agnes Martin in this section because I believe that the way that Agnes Martin's sexuality and persona manifest in the way that she saw herself doesn't fit as neatly within the categories that we would like it to. I don't think it felt that neat and tidy for her. It's not that neat and tidy today, but she's definitely somebody who lived and worked outside of traditional gender norms. And so I'm showing you here 2 examples of her early work for a few reasons. 1, these fall within the parameters of the time period of the exhibition. 2, the gridded work doesn't project very well, and you can just step outside your door and see one of the best representations of that work just a few feet away, so I would be a fool to try and bring it in here, but you can just go see it out there. But I'm very excited. So this is one of the paintings that's outside in the hallway right now. You probably walked by it on your way in. But I think it's interesting, we all know Agnes Martin for the grid, and for those fantastic and striking and subtle and poetic pieces that she does that you can just sit in front of and let yourself melt into. But I do think it's interesting to think through the way that she works through other kind of popular artistic styles at the time and of this place. Here, of course, New Mexico mountain landscape looking very much like the work of John Morin or other modernists who have visited here. And I would say, even though this is not the kind of thing that she would like us seeing and talking about, holding her own in that ring, this is a very good modernist watercolor rendering of the area. And even though it's not what she wants to be remembered for, I think understanding that she's able to work in that style and master it is important. The same with her untitled oil from the University of New Mexico Art Museum, where she's experimenting with expressionist work and surrealism, and making paintings that are very strong in that genre too, even though later in her life it would not be what she wanted to be remembered for. She held her own with the other artists in this ring. And I'll wrap up by talking about a little bit of an afterword that I want to do in the exhibition. So even though we do have these tidy temporal perimeters, I cannot help myself but sticking my toe a little bit over the line for 2 artists who I love deeply. One being Harmony Hammond. She's loaning this piece, What Have You Done to Our Desires? This is going to be the only time that this work from 1997 has ever been shown. She made it, and then it went away, and it's never been out. And whenever I spoke with her about this exhibition, this is the piece she said, this is what I want people to see. And it's a commentary on domesticity and the restraints of domesticity, and Harmony Hammond's Mind for Many Women, and the kind of negation of desire, particularly as she sees it in the narrative of lesbian women who haven't really been given the room to express these aspects of their own identity in their artwork. And the other reason why I'm not only excited to show her work, but I really have to show her work, is because I stole the title of the exhibition from her. In 1990, she curated an exhibition called Out West. It was contemporary gay and lesbian artists, and it was just such a good title. I thought, why reinvent the wheel? This is perfect. I asked if we could use it. We were going to tell everyone that she came up with it first, and there's going to be a case with, we hold the archives of that exhibition at the Museum of Art, so some really interesting photographs from the opening and brochures and notes about it to get a little look at what that moment was in the 1990s for her. And the other person being Domus Howell, who is kind of our own Tom of Finland for New Mexico, who got their start painting at the docks in New York, now lives and works in TRC and makes these striking, and I should say this is a big piece, not quite life-size, but it feels that way. Representations of gay cowboys here in the West. And I think that he's really mastered this tight, beautiful painting of gorgeous people. But as gorgeous as his cowboys are, I have to give some credit to the way that he's made the sweetest cow that I've ever seen in my life. And with that, I want to just wrap up with a few plugs. If you have found this interesting, I'd recommend picking up Walter Cooper, who's also a fantastic artist in his own right. But he wrote this great memoir, Unbuttoned Gay Life in the Santa Fe art scene. It's a really terrific read. Please come and see the show if you feel so inclined. It'll be Out West Gay and Lesbian Artists in the Southwest. It's opening November 11th. That date is getting closer every day, but it's going to be ready, and it's going to be good. And on October 6th, we're going to be opening an exhibition on Rick Dillingham, who is another important member of the queer community who, they're a potter. This is a major retrospective of their work spanning their entire career. Our associate curator, Katie Doyle, has organized this. It'll be opening October 6th, and it will look at Dillingham's life, his work. She's been able to track down some of his AIDS pieces, which are very difficult to find, and we'll have a couple of those representations here. Dillingham was a contemporary artist, a potter. He worked at the Maxwell Museum, became an expert in Native American pottery of the Southwest, had fantastically strong relationships with people like Marie Martinez, and we've got some photographs of them together. Had a fantastic relationship with Beatrice Wood, who, if you don't know about her, look her up because she's a real pistol. And some of the pieces that they collaborated on together too. Yeah, another just fantastic person who contributed to the New Mexico art community. Oh, right, he also wrote the 13 Families of Pueblo Pottery. And I would lose my job if I didn't tell you all to come on September 23rd, where we'll be opening a second museum venue dedicated just to contemporary art and the rail yards in Santa Fe. We're going to be having our opening celebration on November 23rd, and I hope you'll all come out and join us. And here is the plug for the Southwest Art History Conference that's going to be happening here in Taos, New Mexico in October, just up the street from the Naval Dodge House. I'll be giving a talk on Agnes Sims, so you can learn more about her. Kate Ward will be giving a talk about Anne Noggle, Guys in Disguise, so about the role of identity and masking and playing with gender identity in her own work. And Katie Doyle will be talking about Rick Dillingham. Her talk, it's over, isn't it? Rick Dillingham's AIDS series. I'm very thankful that the Southwest Art History Conference is allowing us to do this panel on gay and lesbian artists working here over the last century. And those are all the plugs that I have. Thank you for sitting through them. And I'll take any questions if we have time for them. I bet we don't, because I went very
Yeah, we have a few minutes for a couple of questions. So if you raise your hand, I can bring the microphone. That way we can make sure everybody can hear.
I can never tell if no questions is a good thing or a bad thing.
Was Ansel Adams contemporaneous with Laura Gilman, and did they work together?
Yes, they knew each other. I don't know that they worked together and that they would have, really done collaborative projects, but they're definitely of the same moment. So good question. Ma'am?
Great talk, thank you, Christian. My question is, how are you handling the artists who didn't necessarily embrace their identity as being queer, trans, gay, lesbian? How are you handling that in the exhibition and talking about that? Sorry, hard question.
Hard question, indeed. And that's really, one of the struggles for working in this time period, right? So I would say that we're taking it on a case-by-case basis. Some artists, Marston Hartley, Katie Wells, and Noggle, those are very easy. Other ones, I'm working on just making sure that we've got some kind of real documentation to make sure that what we're saying is true. I'm not trying to out anybody that really didn't want to be out, or also engage in narratives by certain artists where folks have projected their own kind of Freudian ideas on their work that I think are not really particularly well-founded. So it's kind of combing through biographies and seeing what we can find there. But it's a hard thing to do with this period, right? Because people weren't out for a very good reason. And we also don't want to tell tales out of school. We don't want to apply particular aspects to their life and career that aren't actually there, aren't actually true. And I want to make sure that even though, the theme of this exhibition is about their identity, at the end of the day, I want it to be about their work too. And for folks to be able to come and appreciate each of them on a case-by-case individual basis. Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi. It's obvious that you're very passionate about this area and knowledgeable. What spurred your dedication to it?
Probably being a gay person. I mean, that's a flippant answer, but it's also, very true. I think that a lot of us bring our own baggage and stories to what we work with. And, as a gay person who did find themselves in many ways in New Mexico, for better or worse, who works with historic artists mostly, I look back and I see a kinship and relationship to a lot of these people, and I think it's important that their stories get told. And sometimes you just find yourself with a situation of, well, if I don't do it, I don't know who will. So thank you.
You were talking about the two-spirit, and the examples you gave were all men who then worked as women. Was the opposite true? Women who
don't know that. That's a very good question, and I don't know that much about that. So I would love to learn more about that. That's research I need to do, and that's research that I'd love to hear more about. If anybody else in the audience knows.
Let's give one more round of applause to Christian.